I wish I was a cabin boy aboard a man of war. Sam's gone away aboard a man of war. Pretty work, brave boys, pretty work, I say. Sam's gone away aboard a man of war.
My name is Samuel Siegel. I am Executive Director of the Schooner Pursuit Historical Society. We are based out of Quakertown, Pennsylvania. That's in Bucks County. We portray sailors during the 18th century, specifically privateers. I am open to just about any question regarding privateers of the American Revolution and on what we are and what we do. So let's get some questions going. So let's start off with, what is a privateer? A privateer is someone who has a license from any particular government to hunt, harass, plunder, pirate, whatnot, enemies of that particular government. In our case, we portray both sides of the Revolutionary War conflict, but we have more documentation as far as the colonial rebel side. The question is after the battles of Trenton and Princeton, did Colonel John Glover leave to become a privateer? As far as I know, he did not. John Glover was, I believe, Colonel Glover that you're asking about was in charge of the Marbleheaders, or I want to say the Massachusetts 14th Regiment, or 15th. Not too clear on what regiment he was a part of, but no, they were actually the privateers that Washington was famed for creating. They weren't really privateers. They were actual soldiers that had grown up in a seafaring area, so every single one of them was familiar with how boats worked and how to operate them. Washington at that time, this was just at the start of the war, he actually purchased to lease, or through lease, 3 schooners in which he had that regiment kind of go and act as a fledgling naval force, but they were actually Army vessels. They were not privateers. I'm not really quite sure what happened to Colonel Glover after the battles of Trenton. I do know that they operated privateers for a good year and a half. It's interesting to note that during the Revolutionary War, there were almost 1,700 letters of marque signed by Congress. So they actually had far more privateers than they'd had continental naval ships at the time. The primary reason for the privateers being as popular as they were was at the creation of the Navy, which was actually considered a bold plan at the time. Nobody had ever gone up against the Royal Navy, and to get any continental force to do that was considered ludicrous or ridiculous at the time. In fact, proponents of it that brought it up into Congress from Rhode Island, people in Congress actually that were against it, called it the most wild plan. And it was actually debated for quite some time. The use of privateers came about with, or the Dean brothers really. Basically, one of them was a representative in Connecticut. He was a representative of Congress, and his brother had written him saying, "We would like to be able to do this. Can you bring that up?" And that's basically what happened. Question is, would privateers have the same rights to share of whatever they captured as sailors on official naval ships that took prizes? Yes and no. To some extent, the naval vessels, they would do it, and that would, of course, that would go for the cause. On a privateer crew, they were actually, it was in the rules of engagement or their bond that they would sell to Congress whatever they captured, and the crew would actually get a percentage of that. But as far as the sailors aboard naval vessels, they got their living wage as a naval sailor. It was actually more lucrative to become privateersmen than it was to be a part of the Continental Navy at that time. Now, I had mentioned a letter of marque, and we actually have an example to show you. This is our letter of marque. This was an actual copy printed out, signed by John Hancock. It was originally blank, but we filled it in to serve our purposes. And you had to have this, which you had to pay a bond of what the equivalent of today's money would be, $20,000, in order to get that. So it was a lot of money at the time. And if you broke this, you didn't get it back and you got jailed, or if it was severe enough, even executed. But the letter of marque was nothing without this, and this is the letter of instructions that were to accompany it. And you had to have both pieces of paper with each other in order to get it. This gave you your permission. This told you your do's and don'ts. Privateers at the time, when that was all brought about, it was debated for 4 months on whether or not to allow privateers into the fight for the cause. And during that 4 months, some of the states actually took it upon themselves to issue state-sponsored letters of marque, or you would have state navies in that case, like the Pennsylvania State Navy or the New Jersey. Question is, who printed the letter of marque and letter of instructions that we use? And okay, they are not modern they're modern reproductions. No, they were not done in a printing press. And I'll get to the second question, which was, what would we do to keep these documents handy and safe? Honestly, they would stay either on the person of the captain, either in a pocket, or they would be in his desk in his quarters, along with the ship's log and stuff. So they would be safe and reasonably kept out of harm's way unless the ship sank or something. As far as who printed them, I had them done, and then I aged the paper, or antiqued the paper, using a tea rubbing method to make them look a little older than they are. The SPHS, or the Schooner Pursuit Historical Society, we're not a reenactment unit. We're not really a reenactment group. We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We operate a mobile living history museum, and we set our period fly or pavilion. It's 10 foot by 10 foot, and we set that up at different historic sites and events and festivals throughout the year. This year has been challenging, so we've taken to doing online things. But we're not a reenactment group. We're more along the lines of an institution, because we are, in fact, operating a museum. Hope that answers those questions. Let's see, we can get into combat naval vessels, because that was actually pretty much the same as it was during the golden age of piracy. You would have ships that would use similar tactics with flags. There's no documented case of them using a black flag during it, but I'm pretty sure that, and this is getting into dangerous territory for some, I'm pretty sure that if they had it, somebody would have raised it to have a historical sense of irony, because nobody at that time on the Patriot side of things really cared for the crown or what they thought. We would often raise the Navy Jack. We would actually cozy up to them using a red ensign, and then switch colors and raise it that way, and either the offending ship would choose to fight or submit. And if they fought, there would be boarding actions, which you would have little items and trinkets like this. This is a replica of a model 1756 Sea Service, British Sea Service pistol. As you can see, flintlock, and you had one shot. It may or may not go off, and then you had to resort to using a club. Boarding vessels was very dangerous. There were many different weapons in play at that time for those. Naval privateers were looked at as kind of a naval militia. We just had better pay. I think there's so much on the topic that it's getting it out. I get a little tripped up. Food of the time was, for sailors, was a rather interesting mix. You had what started off as a soup, which would have beef or whatnot, and then by the end of the week it ended up into a stew. Question is, did privateers get second choice of ships, decommissioned Navy ships, etc.? There were no decommissioned naval vessels at that time. The way that worked was basically a ship owner would, or somebody who owned a company or for shipping and transport of goods or services, would apply and basically pay for the bond of getting the letter of marque. If approved, great, you got the letter of marque, but you would basically have to either use your own vessel or you would have to buy one or have one built at the time. But at that time, at the start of the war, we only had 4 vessels, 2 of which were basically rehashed and fixed up broken down ships. The question, do you have connections to the Seaport Museum or the Revolutionary War Museum? Officially, no. We had started to try to get to do some living history on board the Diligence, which is the mock-up of a Revolutionary War era schooner on the inside of the Seaport Museum. We had everything ready to go, and we were going to start putting dates in for this year, but plans kind of got changed. So a privateer was kind of like a pirate with paperwork. Yes, piracy was alive and well all the way up actually into today's society. It was that golden age which ended around 1730-ish, but piracy was still well and going. It was just kind of hushed because the crown did this whole execution and then pardoning thing. So, but yeah, the subject came up in 1775, and by 1776 they were starting to you would see privateers running about. Now, the following year, King George kind of got sick of his shipping lines being disrupted as much as they were, so he actually authorized privateers on the British side of things. But you had to be an Englishman. You couldn't live in the colonies to start with and be a privateer. It wasn't until a year or two later that they finally allowed the West Indies the right to sign their own letters of marque in favor of pursuing protections for the crown. A lot of loyalist colonists decided that they would do that, and it wasn't until middle towards the end of the war that they just didn't care anymore. We've tried to research the numbers on how many loyalist or British privateers there were, and the only estimates we can find are anywhere between 800 to 900. So they had about half as many as we did at that time. Let's see. Did pirates and privateers ever clash? No. The privateers, yes, that happened all the time, because you had the loyalist privateers and then you had the rebel privateers, and they would fight each other all the time. there was a couple of back and forths indicated in the timeline that happened with various vessels. First, the privateers would get, the Continental privateers would capture a British ship, and then the British privateers would recapture and repatriate the captured vessel. And that actually happened a few times. Did pirates resent privateers for not being hanged to the exact same things that they were doing? I don't think they paid attention, to be perfectly honest. They were kind of off doing their own thing. At the time of the Revolution, most of the well-known actual pirates during the Golden Age were long dead. So the lesser pirates, you're always going to get that. None of them really seem to matter. I'm pretty sure that they helped out, but as far as resentment, there's no documentation of it. Let's see. The question is, can I recommend a contemporary account by a privateer or whatever affiliation? There's a few of them. Let's see. The first two privateers that Congress actually gave letters of marque to, one was called the Congress, and the other one was called the Convention. And they were both out of Philadelphia. So they were bringing ships back and forth. Little Egg Harbor, New Jersey was actually a privateer safe haven for us. And we were constantly bringing prize ships and goods into there, and there it would be sold. One of the better known accounts of a privateer battle was in the Delaware Capes, and there was actual mention of that one. That was, I'd have to look it up. I haven't even come across that yet in the timeline. Yeah, it happened April 8th of 1782. This is actually going to come up in the next episode of the timeline, not the one coming up, but the one after that. But April 8th of 1782, the Battle of Delaware Bay, you had three privateers that were protecting a small flotilla of merchant vessels that were on their way to Philadelphia. So the three ships ended up coming in or going out, and they actually met with these merchant ships that were on their way from the Bahamas in that area. And as they approached, they the privateers sent the merchant ships on because they were being tracked by the British Navy, and a huge battle ensued. It ended up going down that there were two Royal Naval vessels and a privateer versus three American privateers, and two of the ships from both sides ended up beached and out of commission, and it left one-on-one. It was the Hyder Alley versus the General Monk. In that, they actually mention Bucks County Sharpshooters unit, or a militia unit from Bucks County, where we happen to be from. And it's actually one of the few, if not the first, dedicated and recorded actions that actually had a shot of, hey, check this trick shot out. So when I publish my paper on that, which will be very soon, you'll be able to read more and hear more about that. Let's see. So privateers might form a protective convoy for the client ships. Yes, that happened on a number of occasions where Congress would say, hey, we need these supplies. We have X number of ships coming up, and the Royal Navy cannot, or not the Royal Navy, the Continental Navy can't protect them because they're off doing whatever. We had far more privateers and state navies and naval vessels than we did Continental. It was really, really, really uneven. There was some 14,000 guns that the privateers had, and compared to only like 6,000 of the Continental Navy. And by guns in that, I mean cannon. As far as other privateers, there was one recorded case of piracy. Again, I just got to this. It's actually the last episode and the one that I'm working on currently. Flip through the timeline here. Yes. A Captain Douglas of the privateer vessel Hunter on April 20th of 1779, he actually committed acts of piracy. He did a huge no-no. He went off and captured 2 Spanish vessels. And the Spanish were, at the time, they were loosely our allies. They hated the British, so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. He was found guilty of an illegal capture on 2 counts, but he was never thoroughly prosecuted. He lost his commission. They had threatened jail time, but apparently he had friends in high places, and his bonds were paid, and he was free to go. And they apparently didn't mind because he ended up getting a letter of marque back sometime later. Let's see. I had mentioned briefly about food, how they start with a soup, and at the end of the week it would end up being stew. Well, they had things like this. This is a ship's biscuit. So they are real. I do make them. In fact, whenever we do events, there are certain members of the Highlander unit as well as the British or the Crown Forces like to come and commandeer them from us. Apparently we make really good biscuits. They were used as a way to transport flour. They were also used as filler in the soup. You crumple it up and ground it into again a small powder and then throw it in, and it would actually thicken things up. We make one of our favorite on board our ship, the Pursuit. One of our favorite meals is lobscouse, which is basically, it's kind of like a beef stew. We use venison, and crew can't seem to get enough of it. But we actually use the biscuits in there to thicken it up. And you'll see us sometimes at events, and you'll smell a heavenly smell, and that's what we'll usually end up having cooking in the pot. So, and how they prepared meals on board a ship, the kitchens of the time, at least for the seafaring vessels, not the intercoastal ones, they would actually have laid out brick or some kind of stone, and they would build an actual open fire inside the ship to do that. How is the knowledge of scurvy in this period? Well, we knew about citrus. We knew about that it was at that time, it was pretty common knowledge about scurvy at that time. Whether or not you could afford to get the limes, the lemons. Oranges were pretty much down in Hispaniola, so oranges really didn't see too much of a thing. They were considered a rich food, so you had to have money in order to have oranges. Would privateer ships be fitted out with as many guns and arms as regular ships? It varied from ship to ship. At that time, the Continental Navy and the Continental Forces, they were putting guns on everything. There was the gunboat Philadelphia, in which they had a 12-pounder on the bow of a whaleboat and 2 3-pounders going off each side. So they were putting cannons on everything. Ships could only carry a certain amount before it would actually sink their waterline, and too much weight is not a good thing. It slows you down, and it also makes it easier to get beached in the water. So if the vessel could handle it and they were looking to defend themselves, yeah, they would put as many on as they could get a hold of. So a regular ship, like a ship of the line, no, the ship of the line is going to have far more guns than a privateer. Although I'm sure that in some cases it was unbalanced. The Schooner Pursuit Historical Society, we've been around since June of 2016. We have just kind of jumped off the deep end and into the history books trying to do this. We started off with our own schooner, of course, thus Schooner Pursuit Historical Society. And through learning all about that kind of thing, when we lost the pursuit, we decided against changing the name because it's still a pursuit. We're going to get a schooner eventually, so it kind of fits. Plus, we're in pursuit of particular knowledge. Question, I wondered if people who wanted to run away from bad lives and entered servants on the Lamb, for example, Al's or Jail's berth, would get a berth on a privateer vessel. Yes, being a sailor was the only equal job you could have, and it did not matter creed, finance, color of skin, didn't matter where you came from. As long as you could do the work, you were hired. They actually, the powers that be, in order to keep all the sailors from jumping ship from the Continental Navy and going to be a privateer, they actually put in there that you could only have 1/3 of your crew actually had to be landlubbers, basically from farms and stuff like that. So yeah, criminals and stuff, destitute. There's some documented cases of men growing beards to avoid press gangs. Yeah, press gangs were horrible. In fact, I was just putting a thing on finishing up a timeline video last night for the next issue, for part 4, and there was cases of in August of 1780 there was 3 ships that they kind of banded together, the Holker, the Fair American, and started off with the Enterprise but ended up swapping out to be the General Green, and they kind of created their own flotilla at that point, or their own squadron, I guess, if you would, to go hunt. Anyway, so the Holker and the Fair American, on their way in to resupply, were actually captured by Continental Navy vessels. They were released, but the Continental Navy took 2/3 of each of the crew. They left them with basically a skeleton crew, enough to make it back to port, and that was it. They took the rest of the sailors. So press gangs were not to be trifled with. That happened on both sides, and it didn't matter. There was such a shortage of sailors and warm bodies, and at that time it was, you learn to do it real quick, or they'd fire you, and where is there to go? And actually, that's where that term walking the plank came from. It didn't mean you'd actually walk a plank. You were told to walk down the gangplank. You were done. You were fired when they got to port. Unless you decided to do something completely and totally unscrupulous, you were either executed or thrown overboard. But again, walking the plank, though, that's more of akin to being handed a pink slip. Shanties, they were done and they weren't done. Singing shanties for fun didn't come about till the 19th century. During the 18th century, they had work songs, and there weren't very many of them, but that's what would be sung to do different types of jobs, like a heave-to, or that would be for loading cargo or hauling in the anchor line. They got different things. Some vessels had a windlass, some had a capstan. The windlass is actually a device that hauls up the anchor at the bow of the ship. Capstan is more of windlass goes this way to bring chains up. A capstan goes this way. Here's a little tidbit as far as small arms. Most weapons of the time, if they were on board a ship and they were kept on a ship, they actually would tar the barrel to keep it from rusting. Keeping weapons clean in a salt air environment is very difficult to do. And I noticed that when I took my pistol. I'll show you here. I had taken this down and fired it off a couple of times when I was down in St. Augustine and down in Virginia, and it's still shiny, but there is some rust and discoloration there that I cannot get rid of no matter how much I polish. And some of it also has to do with the way that some of the barrels are currently made by lesser quality materials. Did society in general look down on privateers? Was it seen as a dishonorable way of making one's way in the world? To some extent, yes. To some extent, no. They would look at privateers as how we today would look at lawyers. Or it was considered a noble profession, and at the same time, it wasn't, because it was such akin to piracy. For people to wantonly hunt others, it's not looked at favorably. I wouldn't say it was seen as dishonorable so much as it was, oh, they're a privateer. Now, and as far as reenactment status and stuff like that goes, we're looked at with a bit of trepidation. But I think that's only because not many people know about it. And I truly wish more people would take an active interest in it. That's what we kind of do. Let's see, to add to that, they said kind of like bounty hunters now. Yes, we were looked at, that is a good way of making that bridge there. Yeah, that I'm going to have to use that now. It was actually, at the same time, people are attracted to that kind of thing. I have here one of the things that we use for recruitment are snippets like that. They're little just pieces of paper that you would actually find pieces of paper with some printing on it. If it wasn't in a newspaper article, they would print off these cards and they would leave them in taverns and stuff. And this says, the only thing that I changed was the name of the vessel and the port, and of course my name and the date. But the wording is exactly out of a recruitment flyer for wanting privateers. It says, now fitting for a privateer in the harbor of Philadelphia, the schooner Pursuit, a strong good vessel that purpose and a prime sailor, any seamen and landmen or persons that have an inclination to make their fortunes in a few months may have an opportunity by applying to, would list the ship's captain and the port that it would be found in, and then the date. So this kind of thing was well sought after. Adventure was all the rage at the time, and you'd had people that wanted to get involved in the conflict because they believed either one side or the other, but they had either particular skills. They didn't make the cut for the army or the militia, so they would then choose to become a privateer. It was a very lucrative and industrious profession at the time. It's widely known that several members of Congress held letters of marque, and they helped businesses that held letters of marque. Everybody was getting into it because it was easy money. You send a ship of people out to go attack another ship, and more times than not, they would surrender to the privateers because it was, hey, I'd rather live, and then the insurance and stuff would kick in and the ship owners would be fine, but I would rather live than die a horrible death at sea. So a lot of the times, if they fought against it, they would lose. It was typically privateers, much like pirates, would only go after vessels that they were fairly certain they could win against. There was lots of subterfuge on either side of that. There were lots of different ways you could go about hiding the number of crew or the number of guns. Most often you would be able to tell because of how low the vessel would be sitting in the water. Actually, that's kind of what they were. There's a song, I'm going to segue into this now, called Barrett's Privateers. Completely not period correct, but the subject matter is period correct. The song was actually written back in the 1970s, but it was about events that actually did happen during the Revolutionary War. They would lure loyalist privateers in by saying, hey, come help us, we can capture the American gold and use it for ourselves. Or we'd get a percentage and then the rest would go to the crown. But either way, it would, the gold being the object, and they would be able to tell by how weighted down a ship was, because gold is a lot heavier than a lot of other objects, and it would bring the ship to where the water line would be higher than normal. So one way of doing that would be cannon, because they also would weigh it down. It was either they were loaded with gold or loaded with guns, and unless you knew, without beyond a shadow of a doubt, it's kind of anybody's guess. Do you let the ship go, or do you risk it all and pray that they don't fire upon you? That's pretty much how that was done back in the day. Well, things that we do. You can see some of the stuff here behind me. Where I sit, I usually do filming for the privateer timeline of the Revolutionary War, and I'll read off a bunch of different events, but this is an actual one of the timeline boards. This is actually from part 4 that I'm still currently editing. So we do things on that nature. And over here, we've got our whaleboat project, we've got our museum, and then of course we do battle reenactments as well. We don't do too many of those because we can't find a lot of where privateers were, and where they were is mostly in the coastal areas, but we're hoping to change that. One of the ones that we do quite frequently in the area, in fact we've done it the last 4 years, is the battle at Historic Hope Lodge every November. So we typically we fall in with the British side because they need it, so they kind of are the highest bidder at that point. But since we play both sides, it's very easy for us to do that. Another project we have, aside from the whole living history aspect, is our boat. We actually have a 28-foot whaler that we're trying to bring home so that we can get her fixed up, eventually back in the water, but we're going to end up using her as a static display for the museum until we can get her fixed and back in the water. And then the plan is to hopefully see her in one of the crossing events at Washington's Crossing. But that's long time away. Between now and then, though, we can actually go through and do some of the more prevalent tactics that whaleboats were used in for privateers. There was quite a few privateers that actually used whaleboats. Biggest way you can look us up to get involved is at our website, www.untitled www.sphsociety.org. We can also look up the Schooner Pursuit Historical Society on Facebook. You can follow me from my Facebook page or my profile page. Very easy to find. I'm trying to think. We've got 5 more minutes, but I'm guessing that we won't have any last-minute questions here. So, let me see. Rum rations were a real thing. They went by the wayside within my lifetime. Well, actually, just before my lifetime, I should say. I want to say the last rum ration was 1970. I'm not quite sure. Don't quote me on that. Well, thank you very much. Somebody said, I learned a little bit more about this period in history today. Thank you. It was very interesting. Good luck with your future projects. And thank you for coming in and supporting us and being a part of us. Do try to follow us. We are actually doing an event here at the home office on Saturday, but we'll be broadcasting that live for an hour or so on Saturday, June 20th, between 7 and 9. You can find more about that via our Facebook page, facebook.com/TSPHS. And I want to thank Living History Live for allowing me to do this for them. Ooh, one last question. Right before got in under the wire there. How did the privateers use the whaleboats? Well, it all depended on what side you were on. A lot of the tributaries that came down were a little shallow, so they had to use them, fill them with men, row out. Sometimes they would have either be having their own firelocks in the boat with them, or they would have swivel guns on the bow or on the sides. But they would row out, swarm, do what they had to do, and then row back. The Loyalists used a tactic called refugee, in which they would feign, hey, our whaler was sunk or caught fire or whatnot, or we're damaged and we're astray, we're refugees, help us, and then turn around, attack the vessel from within once they got hauled up. And those are just 2 of the ways that they used them. During the Battle of the Delaware Capes that I mentioned a little bit earlier, this is kind of a cool thing. What they did was the American forces actually would go out and rush out to go help one of the vessels that had run aground. They had got all the cargo off and into the boats and hightailed it out, and they had kind of wrapped some gunpowder in with one of the sails, lit that as a fuse, and that went all into the hold just as the British came in, and the whole ship exploded, getting rid of a lot of British. So that's one little tidbit right there. And on that note, I want to thank everybody for listening to me ramble on a bit. Very good questions. Was very appreciative. We do this kind of thing actually on our own Facebook page about once or twice a month. So I do encourage everybody to come check us out. And I want to thank you all very much for participating. And have an awesome day.
I wish I was a cabin boy aboard a man of war. Sam's gone away aboard a man of war. Pretty work, brave boys, pretty work, I say. Sam's gone away aboard a man of war. I wish I was a gunner aboard a man of war. Sam's gone away aboard a man of war. Pretty work, brave boys, pretty work, I say. Sam's gone away aboard a man of war.